Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Today we are joined by Dion Lopes, an accomplished engineering leader with a deep track record in the medical device industry. Dion has worked in a variety of roles such as Director of Manufacturing Engineering at Imperative Care, Senior Manager of Manufacturing and Production at Intersect ENT, now part of Medtronic, and various leadership positions at PneumRx and Ortho Clinical Diagnostics. His expertise spans across product development, regulatory submissions, and the implementation of various manufacturing technologies. Dion, thank you so much for joining us today on the Being an Engineer podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, what made you decide to become an engineer all those years ago?
Growing up, I'm Portuguese. Soccer's huge in my family. And my dad is an electrician by trade, but he's kind of a master of few, tinkerer, and expert of many.
Nice.
If you will. So he likes to get in and figure things out. And so I was always with him growing up. And as he would figure things out on the car, or we'd rebuild a carburetor, or we'd, do something, or, come together with a jig to weld something for a tractor. I always liked that. I always loved taking things apart. And it kind of was just a natural progression from there into engineering.
Wonderful. Terrific. I was similar, not so much with welding things, but just always taking things apart when I was a kid and putting them back together and fixing my bike and Legos. I don't know. Were Legos a part of your background as a kid?
They were.
Yeah.
They were, without a doubt.
Awesome. All right. Well, you've worked with a variety of complex manufacturing processes. And one that I think I read about just a little bit was pneumatic welding for nitinol wire, which I don't even know what pneumatic welding is, to be honest. That was a new term for me. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about that. And then if you can share things that, of course, are not confidential, one or two key challenges that you faced integrating this process and maybe how you overcame it.
Sure. So when we say pneumatic, it was basically welding with pneumatics, right? So the welder that we had, it was a standard welding process. We had electrodes, we had dies to hold the material, we had, argon gas, we had, standard process controls. But what we had with this, and we were manufacturing products, is it was a very manual process early on. Operators were feeding a wire in, they were trying to get a certain amount of the wire out of the dies, and then manually pressing the dies against the welder, if you will, to be able to and start the welder and have an arc create the ball on the end of the wire. But as you can imagine, it's all operator variability, how they grip, how far they pull out the wire, how much is extending, how consistent the surface contact is. And so there was just a lot of variables that weren't controlled. When I started with the company, that's, it's the nature of the beast, where, when you have a company that's, early stage startup, the processes are more art, right? And then, the challenge is you become more commercial as you take them into more science, right? So that's what we had to do. In this instance, we were moving manufacturing facilities, and as such, we had to qualify all of our equipment and processes in order to get, BSI and FDA approval to manufacture. So this is one of our critical processes that was kind of hit or miss with the manual process. So I worked with several engineers, operators, technicians to get feedback and develop a semi-automated piece of equipment that used linear stages with dials where you could dial in X and Y orientation to center it on to the opening of the welder, specific tools to allow consistent exposure of the amount of material, the amount of wire that had to be welded. So it was consistent, the amount that was protruding from the dies, and then controlled mating of the surfaces so that when you hit the button to weld, we would get a consistent ball in terms of diameter and location on the wire where the centers were concentric.
What are some unique challenges to welding with nitinol as opposed to, aluminum or steel for people who are listening right now and thinking, oh, I've got a project coming up where I think we might have to use nitinol to weld something. What are some unique challenges there? And what, again, if it's not, some confidential process, are there any pro tips you have to being successful doing so?
So for us, it was interesting. That was actually one of the first times I've welded with nitinol. Everything else that I've done has been around laser cut stents out of tubing. And so from this standpoint, it's really getting the process optimized to be able to weld nitinol. It's just like characterizing any process where material is a variable, right? So there wasn't anything extremely challenging with it. It's just making sure you have a properly characterized process for that. Now, obviously, one of the things you need to make sure when you're processing and melting nitinol or the properties of the welded nitinol, have you done anything where you caused any embrittlement or impacted the strength of the nitinol and not only of the base nitinol, but of the ball of nitinol that's been reformed. But with doing proper testing and ensuring you have the proper tensile and, the tips that are welded, that are melted aren't falling off. That's what helps you determine how reliable your process is.
Nice. You talked about going from a manual process to a more automated process or more like full production process. What are some of the challenges that you commonly see when you're taking a manual process where, like you said, there's maybe some more of an art to it than science, and you're trying to move it to a more science-based production process? What are some of the common challenges that you've seen?
Well, I think, first and foremost, you have to understand the state of the business that you're working for, right? Like, when a company is early stage, it's startup, you want to make a safe product, you want to make an efficacious product, you want it to be reliable for the patients, right? And so you're doing anything you can to get that product into production, right? The stability of the process, the throughput of the process aren't necessarily, the reliability of the process aren't really the things that are first thought of, right? It's when you're going from that early stage into trying to develop into more commercial organization. I usually use the term putting your big boy pants on, that as you start to see more volumes, that you're generating more clinical evidence, where really you get to see the beauty of the art that was brought into production, and then just the complexity of how you need to take that art and make it into more science that's stable, predictable, while maintaining the safety and efficacy for the patients.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So that, that to me is one of the most critical things. From a process standpoint, right? When you're looking to develop a process, right? It's the foundation of how you properly, assess, characterize, develop a process. Foundationally, it's the same, whatever industry you're in. It's that you just need to understand the criticality of that process on whoever the end user is. So, for example, laser cutting an endovascular stent for use in a patient, that process and the processes after that to make that stent are much more critical than processes, let's just say, that you would use to manufacture tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of CDs, right? The reliability that you need, the criticality that you need is that much more. But the foundational understanding of the process, you have to be able to understand the process. The constraints are different, right? Your volumes are very different, right? So what you can accept as risk is very different. There's much less of an appetite for risk for, an uncontrolled process when you're making medical devices than when you're making, CDs or DVDs, right?
Yeah, right. For those engineers listening who maybe aren't super familiar with process development and manufacturing, can you give just one or two specific examples, not stories necessarily, but examples of what are the process characteristics that you're referring to, right? You say dialing in the process. What are some examples of that, at a very detailed level?
So when you look at a process, you're looking for, what the inputs to the process are and what the outputs of the process that you want. So, for example, like if you're honing the inside of a tube, right, that's been laser cut, right? So you have to understand what the output of that process is, right? You have a surface finish that you're looking for. You have an ID that you're looking for after you finish clearing out material. And then you need to look at what the inputs to that process, and I usually refer to them as like, what are the levers and buttons and switches that you have to be able to understand and control and set properly in order to get the output of those processes. So it could be, speed, it could be, diameter of, whatever you're using to impact the surface of the tube. It could be, compression pressure on what you're doing to keep the cut pattern held tightly while you're trying to remove the material to allow consistent material removal. It could be, linear speed. So there's a lot of different buttons and settings that you can set in order to optimize that output. And one of the things with that is, there's interactions between them. So you want to understand what are the settings that are optimal when you identify which ones are critical to the process to get you that output that you want, and others that aren't critical that you don't have to worry about getting a range. Because what's important when you develop a process is when you understand the parameters that are critical, you have a range of those, because you will have material variability, environmental and variability, depending on how semi-automated or automated the process is. You'll have operator variability. So you've got to be able to accommodate those, right? Material variability, as I said. So you've got to be able to accommodate those when you develop a process.
Terrific example. Yeah, when I was a younger engineer, it took me a little while to understand what people were referring to when they talked about process. And it was, I think, several years before it dawned on me that, when they say process, what they're talking about is a manufacturing process. And the word process in the context of engineering anyway is often it's referring to manufacturing. So for those of you out there who maybe don't have a strong background in manufacturing, or you're a student or you're new to the engineering practice, when you hear the word process, think manufacturing and manufacturing process. It's how we make things. How do you make this thing, right? That's what we're talking about. Okay. Dion, can you talk a little bit about an experience maybe where you had to navigate through a particularly tough regulatory hurdle, and what strategies that you used to get across the finish line there? You've worked in medical devices for a long time, and regulatory is a very large and significant aspect of the medical device development world. So if you could share just maybe a quick story about a challenge that you had in the context of regulatory and how you and your team were able to overcome that.
Right. No problem. Yeah, I've got one that is probably one of the most memorable of my career. So, I'm an operations guy through and through. I've worked on, devices that are implantable, surgical devices, and obviously the regulatory requirements when you're looking at implantables and stuff are different than you would have for let's say surgical instruments and so forth, right? Endovascular, like bronchoscopes and stuff, right? The requirements are different. And so we had one, when I was working on nitinol stents, where we had a really technical question that came back from the FDA on one of our tests, that we were doing. And, it was one that, the team, when when the question first came in, a lot of eyes opened up because it was extremely technical that they were asking. So that the responsibility to answer that question was given to me. But I'm one that is values a team, and I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. And I'm gonna, even if I don't know the answer, I'm gonna understand where to find it. So when I was given that responsibility, I quickly assembled a team of SMEs, within R&D, quality, regulatory, multiple engineering fellows to assess, the questions and dissect and break them down. And we established an action plan of how we were going to address them. Then I went ahead, gathered a bunch of technical material that was going to help be able to answer multiple portions of that question. And then I reviewed, ran through the technical material, and compiled it all. And as I'm giving you this over a matter of several weeks, probably about 2.5 weeks of doing all of this, gathering, reviewing, consolidating, drafting an initial response, kind of running through it myself, editing it. And then I took that initial response and sent it to one of our engineering fellows that I worked closely with. And he reviewed it. We worked with other members of the team, finished it, finished the revisions, got it to where we thought it would be good, handed it over to regulatory. They had a couple questions for us. We revised it, ran through it with a couple other members of the regulatory team just to make sure everyone was on board, and submitted it. And we got a response back from the FDA that they accepted our explanation and our response. And it was a huge win for us. It was probably one of the, like I said earlier, one of the biggest highlights of my career.
Wow.
It was a tough challenge. It was, when you're putting in a submission, to be able to respond to the FDA and have them agree and accept that response is just, it's really exciting and it's really fulfilling.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. What a big win. You mentioned that when you received this responsibility, you started reaching out to different people, SMEs, subject matter experts, and fellows and different people on your team. And I think that's a really important aspect to highlight, because especially younger engineers, I think, can fall into the trap of thinking that they need to understand all the technical things. They need to be able to answer all the questions. And that's just not the case, right? You're never going to have all the information, all the knowledge to answer all the things. So knowing where to go to find those answers, who to pull in, what different team members to pull in, that's so valuable. And you don't,
without a doubt.
Yeah, you don't need to do it all on your own. It's always a team effort.
And you shouldn't do it all on your own.
Right. Yeah. Okay. You have spent a lot of time in your career mentoring other engineers. Thinking back to some of those conversations you've had, what are some principles that you've emphasized when guiding younger engineers?
So I have a couple principles that I live by, both when I mentor and, when I look for a mentor for myself. I have several mentors that, I worked with 15, 20 years ago that I'll still reach out to when certain situations arise. So to me, what you really need to, in order to properly mentor, you've got to be able to ensure that, your mentee understands and they have an environment where they can fail safely and they can safely ask questions. And there's not an area that you're fearful of. If I ask questions, that's not going to look good, right? You've got to work to be able to help create that environment where the individual or individuals can feel that they can ask a question, and they're not going to get chastised for they should know that answer, because we're not all going to know that answer, nor should we at all the time. But we've got to be able to understand where to get that answer, and so being able to do that. And the other thing that that's important is helping the mentee understand that it's okay to fail safely. And that's an important environment to create, that I feel that every engineer should have, obviously much more those early on in their careers than you would necessarily need a more senior level. But, one of my mentors very early on in my career said, you can't learn without breaking things. And that is true. You can't. Perfection doesn't exist, nor should it exist in what we've tried to do, because then we would never learn. And that's the most important to be able to do. You've got to be able to make mistakes, but you have to learn from them and be able to bounce back and move on.
Yeah, I love that you brought up breaking things. We just had an event actually here yesterday, and one of the presenters, Roger Lebrecq, a former podcast guest himself, talked about the importance of breaking things. It's great to know how to build things, but sometimes it can be just as important to learn how to break things and learn from them.
Yeah, without a doubt. And that is extremely important. And you've got to be able to do that safely, and understand, and have an organization that embraces that.
Yeah. Well, let me take a very short break here and share with the listeners that the Being an Engineer podcast is brought to you by Pipeline Design and Engineering, where we don't do pipelines, but we do help companies who commercialize hard good products that are complex or difficult to manufacture. We do this by developing advanced manufacturing processes, automated machines, and custom fixtures, complemented with product design and R&D services. You can learn more at teampipeline.us. And today we have the privilege of speaking with Dion Lopes. Dion, how do you evaluate the potential impact of new technologies in your field? Are there some criteria that you use to decide whether or not to adopt new technologies?
So first of all, you have to understand, is there a need for the technology, right? Is it something that's new, that's different, that, hey, we want to try this? Or is it something that there's a need for, a need in terms of, okay, is it an ergonomic need? Is you need a more stable process to remove operator variability? So you go semi-automated or automated. It's the whole make versus buy decision, right? Do we want to? Are the costs from our vendors prohibitive? Where if we brought it in and gained the expertise, it would be we'd have more control of it, more of an understanding of it, more in control of our costs to be able to bring it in, and then assess that, the make versus buy decision, understanding if you have the technical knowledge in-house, or if you have to hire it, or you want to get individuals that are high potential, that you can have them train and learn with industry experts, and understand that, and then be able to invest in bringing that in-house. And then as you're doing that, as you're making those, make versus buy decisions, you always have to assess the cost, the schedule, the resources that are needed in order to make this new technology or process come to fruition. And is it the right time to be able to do that? Or are we in a technical crunch where we've got to be able to do it in-house, because all, the proprietary nature of it is in-house and we've got to be able to do it? Or is it something that, hey, we're having frustrations with vendors and we have to bring it out and bring it in? Or, hey, we'd love to bring it in, but we just do not have the bandwidth or the time, and we've got a critical product coming down the pipe. So we've got to bring in a vendor to do that. So it's a lot of those questions.
Brilliantly answered. It makes me think of a quote that I heard a little while ago. I can't remember who it was that said this, but the quote was, just because you bought a book doesn't mean you bought the time to read that book. And I think it's a very similar sentiment. Just because you purchased a new technology or brought in a new technology doesn't necessarily mean that you purchased the time to learn how to use that technology, support that technology, or maybe a better way to put it is, if you're going to purchase a new technology, make sure that you also have allocated time to get up to speed, learn how to use it, learn how to support it, train people, all of those things, because that's I'm thinking of PDM right now. We implemented PDM at our company a few years back, and oh my goodness, I thought PDM itself was expensive, but it was not nearly as expensive as implementing PDM and training people on it. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you don't invest, if you're going to make the investment to bring in, the capital, let's say a piece of equipment, a technology, right? But you're not going to invest the people, the time, the resources and people, if you will, to gain that knowledge. You basically just bought a large capital paperweight.
That's a good way to put it.
And I think we've all been around that. And I think that's, that is obviously frustrating from an organizational standpoint, right? Because you're dumping capital in on things we're never going to use, but also, from an engineering standpoint, if we've got things that we can use to help processes, develop or characterize or implement new processes or try new processes out, you want to, if you're going to invest the money, you've got to invest the time and the resources to bring it to fruition.
Absolutely. Well said. Given the experience that you have in manufacturing and operations, what are some of the most important skills that you think are required for a manufacturing engineer or even a mechanical engineer, process engineer that is heavily involved in manufacturing in today's fast evolving medical device world?
So one of the things for me is the willingness to learn, willingness to ask for help, and the ability to make mistakes, but bounce back from them, right? Everybody's going to make them, but it's how you bounce back from them, how you recover that's critical, right? And those characteristics, need to be present as we are bringing in and growing the engineering fields and bringing in new hires into engineering. We've got to be able to do that. I've always loathed the term, it's not my job. I've always been one that likes to wear multiple hats, to learn and to get stuff done and to work with others and to get new perspectives, right? On other things. And, you may have one way to do it, but others who have more experience may have tried that and it didn't work, and they can help teach you that, and help you understand that that's not the way to go. But being able to wear the multiple hats to be able to make an impact, and that's much more feasible in smaller organizations than it is in much larger corporate organizations. But the ability to be able to do that, to learn, to ask for help, and to make but bounce back from mistakes, I feel is critical.
Speaking of making and bouncing back from mistakes, how do you balance the need, or do you have any advice on how to balance the need for innovation in which failure is a part of the process and expected, it's going to happen, with the stringent requirements for quality and compliance in the medical device industry, where failure is very much not accepted?
So I think we need to understand, like, what we mean by innovation, right? Like, if we're looking at it, and I just want to make sure I understand your question clearly, like innovation, like a new piece of equipment or a new process, a new technology, is that
exactly right?
So I look at that, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, right? Foundationally, when you set up something new, you have to understand what it can do and why it does what it does. And if what you're asking it can do that, right? If you're bringing a piece of equipment that you need a tight tolerance on, and that piece of equipment cannot hold that tight tolerance, it's not the right piece of equipment. But you need to understand that if you're designing a piece of equipment, or, bringing in a piece of capital, the new technology and so forth, that you need to foundationally and fundamentally understand the equipment. We talked about, levers and buttons earlier. That's what you need to be able to do, is to be able to understand that and bring that in. But it's all about the risk of the process on who the ultimate customer is. And in med device, it's patients, right? The patients don't care what technology we use, right? They don't care if we laser cut versus water jet. It's not important to them. Are we giving them something that's safe, that's efficacious, that's reliable? That's what they care about. That's what the doctors care about. They're not concerned about the technology. if we can put in technologies that can give that to the doctors and the patients. And what I mean by, the doctors aren't concerned about technologies, what's important to them is the outcome of the patient. We could explain to them new technologies, and physicians and stuff always like to understand, new products and new things that are being done. But ultimately, they're going to look for products that are safe and efficacious, as are the patients. And the more we can make products like that we have good clinical data for, and we can use processes that we fully characterize and are reliable and stable, that's the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you think of an experience where a project where you had to significantly alter your approach due to some kind of unforeseen challenge, and how you and your team reacted to that?
So when I was doing some work in China, I lived in China for 3 years. We were having an issue with a couple pieces of equipment that just weren't getting completed by the contract manufacturer, and a couple of us were called in to help move along the process, help complete the site acceptance, the factory acceptance testing, so we could get it to our assembler. And what we thought we were going in was to help understand the schedule, help remove hurdles and roadblocks. When we got there, what it truly was is there were technical challenges that we weren't even sure if the vendor wasn't even sure if the equipment could work and do what we were asking and what we had specified the equipment to do. So we quickly had to change gears from, all right, how are we managing schedule and removing hurdles so that we can get this piece of equipment, so we get the product built and equipment qualified and so forth, to, all right, now we've got technical hurdles and technical challenges that we've got to get through to make sure the equipment can even do what we want it to do. So that scope of triage changed into a much more technical base than just a schedule, helping remove hurdles, helping drive and partner with the vendor on that aspect.
Yeah. And how did you handle that? Did you have to bring in people from your team who had that technical expertise, or were you able to address some of those concerns directly yourself?
So I partnered with another individual, and we also had members from the team in the US that we got on the calls and worked closely. Myself and the other team member that were out in China, we had the team give us an understanding of what the equipment needed to do and why, and what some of the challenges were, and what some of the critical aspects of the process were. And then we were able to go and help troubleshoot and identify, areas of risk and concern. And then we brought the team in, and we did it just with phone calls and stuff. We didn't have to fly anybody over at that time, and we were able to together partner, and I emphasize that, partner with the equipment manufacturer to help solve the problem and get the equipment finished, get factory testing done, and get it on site.
Wonderful. And at the end of the day, was the solution helping the vendor overcome these technical hurdles, or relaxing some of the technical specifications of the machine, or a combination of both?
It was pretty much all helping the vendor address the technical hurdles because of the complexity of what the equipment had to do with the medical device it was making. There wasn't much room for loosening any requirement.
Got it. Okay. Well, great example. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Well, I think we're getting towards the end here. I have this personal mission that I've given myself over the past 6 months or so to accelerate the speed of engineering to improve the human experience. And I look around us, right? And pretty much everything around us exists because of engineering and engineers, right? The fans that keep us cool, the TVs on which we're entertained, the phones we use to communicate, stoves, roads, plumbing, all these things were developed by engineers. And I think to myself, if we could only increase the speed of engineering by 5%, what would that mean to the human experience? So I've been asking this question lately towards the end of my podcast interviews. What is one thing that you have done, or that you have found to be effective in accelerating the speed of engineering?
I think one of the things that happens in engineering, whether it's product or process, it's data overload, and you need being able to understand how much data is enough data to make an informed decision that is risk based. Right, a lot of times you'll have analysis paralysis where you're just gathering data and you can't make a decision, and you've got to keep gathering more data in order to get just that increased and continue to increase level of confidence, rather than taking a look at what you have, assessing risk, looking at risk-based decision making, and making the call on the path to go forward. Because not making a call is worse than making a call, having it not be the correct call, but then quickly adjusting and getting back on track. So that's kind of one of the things that I would have a watch out is data is good. You always need data. You need data to make informed decisions, but you need to understand and to avoid data paralysis where you get so much data that it just bogs you down and it really makes it harder to make a decision.
I love that. Sometimes done is better than perfect, right? Is what I hear you saying here. I remember in my first internship when I was still in college, my boss at the time was telling me about when he was interviewed for this position in the company. And he was telling me how he told the president of the company who was interviewing him, I'm not afraid to make a decision. It might not always be the right decision, but I'm not afraid to make a decision, and I can do that. And I thought to myself at the time, why would you say that I might not always make the right decision? That sounds like a terrible thing to say in an interview, but the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that there's so much value in just being able to make a call and take some action and do something. Even if it's not the right thing, you start doing something and you learn pretty quickly if it's the right thing or not. And if it's not, then like you said, you course correct and eventually find the right thing. Whereas if you don't know how to make that decision and it's analysis paralysis, you could go on indefinitely just doing nothing, right? Not making any progress.
And that's, we talked a little bit earlier about leadership, right? And mentoring and, things that I, try to do and some of my pillars to be able to properly, be a mentor as well as be mentored. And to me as a leader, one of the things that I always make sure that I understand is the trenches that my team live in, right? You've got to be able to understand those trenches so that you can help them work through them and get out of them and get to whatever the outcome is, a product, a process, a fixture, a gauge, or whatever that be. But what you have to be able to do is help your team understand that they are empowered and accountable to act, right? So, your team is your team member, your team is empowered to make a decision. Okay, it could be the wrong decision, right? Sometimes that will happen, right? Sometimes that decision will be more critical than others. And so that's where leadership comes in to help provide that guidance. But you have to be able to empower your team so that they understand that they are truly accountable, and that they're in that position to be able to make those calls and go forward. Because if not, and you're constantly micromanaging, then you really don't need that team member. You just do it all yourself. And that's not the intent. That's not how you grow an organization or a team.
There's another quote that I can't remember who said, but it's hanging on my wall in my office. And the quote says, "When in doubt, assume you're right. Decisiveness is productive." And I always thought that was that was so great. It's a little tongue in cheek, but there's also a lot of truth and wisdom in that. All right. Well, Dion, I think we'll wrap things up here. Thank you so much for being on the show. What a pleasure it has been to talk with you and learn about your background and hear about some of the engineering and manufacturing insights that you've been able to share with the engineers listening to this episode. How can people get in touch with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. My contact information is on there. So anyone that would like to reach out, please feel free. Message me on LinkedIn. My email's there. I look forward to reaching out, to have individuals contact me and to continue to network and get guidance and be able to provide guidance, right? I can help teach others, but it's also really important for me to learn.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you again so much, Dion.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Aaron.
I'm Aaron Moncur, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing advanced manufacturing processes, automated machines, and custom fixtures, complemented with product design and R&D services, visit us at teampipeline.us. To join a vibrant community of engineers online, visit thewave.engineer. Thank you for listening.